All right, so here we are at the prophet Ezekiel. Here is the updated schedule, and I went ahead and put in the New Year's stuff in there. So we'll do the first 5 books of the Bible at the beginning of the year. At least that's the plan. Again, it's subject to change. Things can happen. January is a long way away, but the good news is I have done presentations on those before, so I have at least a template, a starting point for those 5. So that was kind of the idea of doing some things I'd done before. I don't have to start completely fresh like I've had to do with all these prophets. But then I did them, gosh, 10 years ago now, so they need some updating, but at least I've got a foundation, so they won't be quite as starting from scratch. We got 2 more prophets to do in this November time, and then we'll do Gospel of Mark and Year A. So we're going to be in the Year A. That's why I picked that one specifically to do that at the beginning of Advent. All right. So let's get into Ezekiel basics. It is another big prophet book. There are, 48 chapters? How many chapters? There's a bunch of them. Yeah, 48 chapters in Ezekiel. So it is a pretty long book. Not as long, I don't think, as Isaiah and Jeremiah, but it is certainly in the top 5 of the prophets, and probably the top 3. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Daniel's up there, of course, as well. But I would probably put him maybe the top 3. It's interesting, as I was reading in the studies, that in some circles, especially Jewish circles, Ezekiel wasn't immediately embraced. By the Christian community, it was immediately embraced as scripture, but some Jewish circles did not accept it, or they were slow to accept it. And we'll get into that a little bit. And I heard that they would not allow people to read the first chapter of Ezekiel because it was so bizarre and questionable and everything. So it's like the banned book. But it is better organized than really the other 2 prophets that we have looked at. It has clear dates that are in there that says on this day, on the 5th day, like as chapter 1 begins, in the 30th year on the 5th day of the 4th month, while I was among the exiles by the river Chebar. And then the little note clarifies what that means. On the 5th day of the 4th month, the 5th year, July 31st, 593. That's so nice. It's like, bam. We got very clear knowledge of when this happens. Now, there is some editorial work, and it can be a little bit confusing at some points, especially for the careful reader. You'll say, now, wait a minute, didn't we already read that? For instance, we hear about the watchman in chapter 3, and then we hear about it again in chapter 33. It's like, wait a minute, I thought we already covered this. So there is some editorial work that puts things a little bit out of order, but is certainly more organized than Isaiah and Jeremiah, which can be pretty confusing, especially Jeremiah. I think I might have talked a few weeks ago, Jeremiah. If I didn't talk about it, it was in my notes. It's kind of like, sometimes I feel like Jeremiah, he had all those things he was going to say, and then he spills all those papers all over, and then he gathers them back up. It's like, all right, well, let's just publish it this way. That's what it sometimes kind of feels like in Jeremiah. But Ezekiel is pretty clearly organized and much better than the other 2. It is written to a community that is in exile, and we'll talk more about that, but that's an important context to keep in mind, that this is to a people who have been kicked out of their homeland, and they are away from the land that they love, far from the land I love. It has some crazy imagery in here. So it can be a little bit hard to read. Here at the very beginning, as I looked in the chapter 1, verse 4, as I looked, a storm wind came from the north, a huge cloud flashing. Within it were figures resembling 4 living creatures that looked like this. Their form was human, but each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and their legs went straight down. The soles of their feet were round. Their faces were like this. Each of the 4 had a face of a man, but on the right side was the face of a lion, the left side a face of an ox. Whoa, it's crazy stuff going on. I was looking at something, it's kind of like a chariot or like a big vehicle coming in, carrying the presence of God, but it's some crazy imagery. One of the commentaries suggested that Ezekiel's imagination might have been sparked, or God used the Babylonian imagery of some of these amazing temples and stuff that they had in Babylonia that might have sparked this way of thinking, that God often uses things in our world and then takes them to the next level. So that might be a way of thinking of maybe some of this is captured in this amazing imagery that there was in the Babylonian art, and then God uses that to show the majesty of God. But it does have some crazy imagery, so it's not necessarily for the faint of heart. And it can be a tough book to read, one, because of that crazy imagery, and one, because God seems so condemning in this book. Ow, stop, ow, stop. So what's going on there? So reading it kind of out of, if you just look at it, and this is like, it's everything we don't want God to be, or everything we hear about in the Old Testament in some ways, right? It's, I am a condemning God, and I am punishing you for this, and I'm punishing you again, and I'm punishing you again. It's a punishing book, at least at first glance. And so it can feel like, why is this even helpful? Why are we even reading this? Why is this in the scripture? So it can be tough to bear and tough to swallow. And we'll jump into that a little bit. I have some thoughts on that. So where are we? They don't know exactly where that Chebar Canal was, or that little river was. That's why there's a question mark there. But look how far they are from Jerusalem. That's a long way away, especially when you don't have planes. But there's Jerusalem. There's the center of Babylon. And when Ezekiel is 30 years old, he receives this vision from God, that chariot or that big vehicle coming in, the presence of God coming in as he's sitting there at the river Chebar. So that is where we are. I'll click, and I'll click again. So when are we? Where are we and when are we? We're at the very end there of the fall of the kingdom. So, I mean, really, the book takes place after all of this. So after, well, a little bit, I guess, during the time of Zedekiah, but the kingdom hasn't quite yet fallen at the beginning, but he is born during this time of Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, and then we are in the exile. So I used this slide earlier for, I think, the Jeremiah, but here are some important dates to remember. So in 605 BC, we have the Battle of Carchemish, which is the fall of Assyria to Babylon. So remember, in Isaiah, the big enemy or the big power was Assyria. Well, in 605, Assyria gets swallowed up by Babylon, and they fall to Babylon. And then you have the first deportation there under King Jehoiakim. So Assyria had kind of was the power there, and now Babylonians taken over, and they are deporting people. That was part of the power play for the empires, was to kind of cut off the head, and then you can reign better. So they first have that first deportation. So some of the royal family was taken there as hostages into Babylon. And then 8 years later, you have the second deportation, and this is the big one. So King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylon king, deports the upper and the middle class, and then leaves some of the people behind. So this was, again, because the people of Israel kept kind of rebelling and stepping up and going against, or the Jewish people. Then they have to say, okay, you're still causing problems. We're going to get rid of more of you. And then finally, you have the third deportation under King Zedekiah. I can't say Zedekiah today. Zedekiah. And that is the rest of the upper and middle class are taken away, and he destroys the temple. So that was like the final straw. It's like, okay, no more. Stop rebelling against me. I am your king now. And now we're cutting off everything. So yeah, you've got in the second deportation, you've got like enough upper and middle class just to kind of manage things and to keep things under somewhat control, and to give the people still a sense that, this is still theirs or whatever. And then in the end, Nebuchadnezzar can't stand it anymore and gets rid of them. So Ezekiel is deported here in the second deportation. So he is brought out from Jerusalem and brought into Babylon. He is part of the second deportation in 597. Which also says that he is part of the upper and middle class. He's part of the priestly class. And so he does have some power, and he does have some training, more training perhaps than our previous two prophets. He was trained in the priestly school and all these things. So he was more educated, which is why his book is a bit more organized. And yet he's pretty eccentric in the way that he does prophecy. Kind of leaning back to the earlier prophets, or what John the Baptist kind of feels like as well. So he's kind of like Elijah or Elisha or some of those early prophets. And John the Baptist resembles Ezekiel as well. Also, there's quite a bit of, as I was reading Ezekiel, you can tell that Jesus has been reading Ezekiel too, because it is very much in his language as well. And then we hear news of the third deportation in chapter 33, and I'll get to that also. So furthermore on when are we? So here are some dates I just pulled out from the New American Bible. Again, the footnotes were helpful again for this. That we have his first call and first vision on July 31st, 593. I just love how specific that is. I mean, it gets confusing when we hear on the 5th day of the month, the 5th year, that is, of King Jehoiakim's exile. Well, thankfully, the New American Bible has taken those dates and translated them into terms that we know, because we don't think in terms of the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile. But July 31st, 593. Where were you on July 31st, 593? Ezekiel was receiving his first call. August 14th, that's my birthday. So many centuries before, on my birthday, Ezekiel was visited by the elders of the people. That is what, chapter, is it 17? I should have put those in there. Chapter 20. Chapter 20, we hear about the elders coming to talk with Ezekiel, and he gives them not great news. January 15th, 588, Ezekiel's wife dies, and he has the vision of the destruction of the temple. And that is chapter 24. And on January 8th, 585, they receive the news that Jerusalem has fallen. So remember, it was 587 that we had the destruction. A couple of years later, the news arrives, because remember, it's a long ways away. There is a refugee in chapter 33. There is a fugitive from Jerusalem who comes and lets them know the city has fallen and the temple has been destroyed. And on April 28th, 573, Ezekiel receives this vision of a new Israel, a new temple, a new people. So the book of Ezekiel starts off kind of harsh, but ends really beautifully. So here's just a basic structure of Ezekiel. Again, I try to keep these as simple as possible. There are way more in-depth, organizations, but very basically, here's the basic structure of Ezekiel. You have chapters 1 through 3, the call of Ezekiel. And this is that interesting piece as well in the beginning of Ezekiel. So we have this vision of this kind of big God chariot coming in to speak to Ezekiel. This is also, it's pretty famous, the eating where Ezekiel eats the scrolls. It's a strange thing. But chapter 3, he said to me, "Son of man," and that's a phrase that is used over and over again in Ezekiel. "Son of man, say this," or whatever. "Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll, then go and speak to the house of Israel." Well, that's very strange. Why am I eating this scroll? It's like kind of this proclamation. So I opened my mouth and he gave me the scroll to eat. And then he said, "Feed your belly and fill your stomach with this scroll that I am giving you." I ate it and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. And then so as sweet as honey is it in my mouth, but then it was also then hard to swallow. Where is that piece about the chapter 2 talks about that as well. Anyway, it was sweet. The idea is it's good news to hear, but hard to proclaim, because the house of Israel was a rebellious house. And so the good news was good, but it was tough to swallow, if you will. So that's the idea. So the first major portion then of the book is these warnings and visions and oracles to the exiles. So he tells them all these things that have happened, will happen, and why they happened. Then you've got another, not quite as big section, but these oracles against the nations, the surrounding areas. And then the final piece is about this new Israel. And that is quite lovely and beautiful. Well, some of it's kind of dry, but I keep getting ahead of myself today, but we'll get to that. So let's talk about, first of all, so we've talked enough about the first for 3 chapters, but getting into the bulk of Ezekiel, at least the first piece. Again, it can be hard to read. It feels like you're getting beat down over and over again. So if you're struggling with seeing the goodness of God, I don't recommend going to Ezekiel and reading that first, because it can be hard to swallow and hard to hear. So a couple of ways perhaps to think of that. I spent a long time yesterday Google searching images and could not find the image that I want, but this is going to have to do. So I wanted to find a picture of people the poor people, kids sitting in a locker room with the towels over their head at halftime, and the coach walking in saying, "What are you doing? You're not following what we have to get in the game. Get your head in the game." So this is the best I could do. So you got this coach, I think that's Kentucky's coach, that is saying, you are better than this. I have instructed you. You know what to do. Get out there and play right. Now, obviously, coaches can get a little bit too emotional and over the top, but a good coach sometimes needs to come off as kind of harsh and explain to them, or maybe at a loss after a game or something. They say, "What? let's go over what happened here." So I've got this image of this frustrated coach. That's maybe one way to think of Ezekiel, that the players are good. They really just did not live up to how they were supposed to play. So it's not if you win or lose, but how you play the game. Ezekiel's kind of like, you have played the game really poorly, and you need to be scolded. And that's why you're going through all this. Why are you going through this pain? You didn't have to do that, but you made poor choices, and now you are paying the price for it. That's kind of the lesson. Or here's this image from those of you who are Royals fans. If you were Mets fans, you might remember, well, if you're a Royals fan, you certainly remember. As a Mets fan, you might remember it differently. But Game 5 of the World Series of 2015, if you remember, Matt Harvey, he's the pitcher there on the left. He had been pitching amazing all through the game. And then the Mets were up 2-0 going into the top of the ninth. And Matt Harvey was pitching a shutout. And the pitching coach came up and said, "Matt Harvey, you're coming out of the game. We're going to bring in the closer to close us out, take the series to Kansas City." And Matt Harvey said, "No, you're not." And he went and protested to the coach, who then says, "Okay, we'll leave you in." And so Matt Harvey comes out, and the fans go wild because he's coming out for the ninth to finish this complete game shutout of the Royals. And then he walks the first batter, and then I think Lorenzo Cain, and then I don't remember who, but he eventually scores, I think all the way from first. And then they take him out too late. So they should have taken him out then, but he leaves him in. Anyway, so you're going back and you're questioning, what happened? What did you do wrong? Well, you should have probably left him in and not try to take him out. And then when he walked the first batter, you should have then taken him out. That's what you should have done. And it's because of this, you have lost the game. So if you are on the side of the Mets, you would say that there were poor decisions that were made. And now you're paying the consequences. This has cost you the World Series because of these decisions. Again, I'm a Royals fan, so I'm quite happy with what all went down. But let's try to think in the terms of what would it be like to be a Mets fan. And that's something important to consider. So that's one way to think of it, is in like teachers. Now, I'm going to get a little controversial here, just as another way of thinking. So don't overthink this and don't report me. But I'm going to get political for a moment, okay? Again, I want us to think about, so like a good way to, I never took debate, but I understand that a good debater can debate from one side and can debate the other side, and you wouldn't know what side they personally hold because they are debating both sides. So that's what I kind of want to do here. So don't panic. I'm not taking any sides. I'm just trying to get into the mindset of what the people of Ezekiel would feel like. Okay. So don't panic. I'm not taking any sides. I'm trying to be a good debater here. So the people in exile, the chosen people of God, have now been kicked out. What went wrong? What have we done? All right. So again, I'm not taking any sides. But in 2016, the people, the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, might have been asking, what have we done? What did we do wrong? And then if there were a response from God, now again, I'm not taking any sides, but let's say the Democratic Party said, we are the people of God. What has happened? What have we done wrong? Well, then imagine like the voice of God saying, look, if you had done this, and if you had done this, and maybe if you hadn't stolen these votes, or maybe if you had, done better about these kinds of things, this wouldn't have happened. But you did this, and therefore you are experiencing the consequences of the decisions that you made. Or on the other side, you might say, the country has turned against you, and the country has hardened its heart and elected other things. And that is why the consequences of the country, that's why that's happened. Okay? We can maybe say the same thing, maybe. Again, I'm not making any claims, but if Donald Trump were to not win the presidency, I think that there are people that are asking, well, what happened? What went wrong? What have we done? And people might say against Donald Trump, they might say, well, if you hadn't done this, if you hadn't done this, if you'd been kinder, if you'd reached out a little bit more, if you'd done these things, then maybe you would have gotten more votes and maybe you wouldn't have lost. Or on the other side, you say, well, the country has turned against you. It's turned against values or whatever. The country has hardened its heart. Okay. I'm not taking any sides. I'm just trying to get into the experience. If you can try to think, if you're more Republican, think as a Democrat. If you're more of a Democrat, think as a Republican, whatever. Try to think from that other side with that empathy or whatever, and think, oh, that's what they are experiencing. That's what the people of God. That's the best analogy that I can make because it's kind of really current right now. Like, what has gone wrong? What happened? That's what the people of God are experiencing, who actually are the people of God. What have we done? What went wrong? And God reveals to them, this is why you are in exile. You have rejected me. You have turned against me. You have done all these things. I warned you not to do this. I sent you my prophets. I gave you all these warnings. This is what you have done. It is your own fault. You have turned against me, and that's why your kingdom fell. That's the message of the first part of Ezekiel. That makes sense? Hope so. Okay, I came across this passage. I think I like this. I think it's the Norman Rockwell. Now, son, do you know what you did wrong? Okay. It kind of feels like this. You're reading all of Ezekiel. Okay, I'm sorry. So all these things, but I also like this. It is meant to be like a compassionate father trying to explain to his children, to his son, here's what happened, dude. You've made poor choices and there are consequences. I think I've shared before that it's my favorite thing that one of my favorite things that my brother was teaching his older son. Let's see, is he 5 now or is he 6? I've lost track. They live in Seattle. But when he was like 3 or maybe even 2, I went to visit them out in Seattle, and they were talking, and Caleb, it's the kid's name, he had done something that was wrong. And my brother David said, okay, Caleb, what happens then? What happens when we make choices? And poor little kid, consequences. There are consequences. So he had to remind him, this is why you are sitting in your room. You are sitting here because you have done this. There are consequences for your actions. This is what Ezekiel is in most of this early part. You have done this. These are the consequences. Here's what happened. And yes, we don't necessarily like, as moderns, thinking of God as an angry God, but that would have related to the people. So let's not be too caught up in that language. But the idea of we are being scolded, and think of a child that says something like, my mom hates me. My mom hates me because she does this or whatever. Think of the people of God saying something similar. God hates me. No, I don't hate you. I love you. You've made choices that are bad, right? So again, if you hear the words of anger of God, think of that as like a 5-year-old saying, my mom hates me. And no, your mom does not hate you. But So now, son, do you know what you did wrong? And then basically we have all these different ways that Ezekiel speaks the word of the Lord to the people and says, here is what happened, and here are the consequences. So in the early part of Ezekiel's ministry, he does kind of, one of the things I was watching talks about, he's kind of like a street performer, or does like street theater. And he's laying on his side and he makes this little model of Jerusalem, and he's doing these things. And he's kind of acting these things out. It's very eccentric. But he does this way of teaching, which is not entirely effective. He gets better as the book goes along, I think, is what part of the point is. Talks about the razor. He cuts off, this is part of his street theater phase as well. Cutting off the beard and putting on the razor and doing these kinds of things. So in chapter 8, he is given a vision of what's happening in Jerusalem. And another reason why Jerusalem falls is because of the abominations that are happening in the temple. So he's been led by the Spirit of God. It reminds me a little bit of like what's that Christmas story? It's a little bit like Ebenezer Scrooge being led by the ghosts of Christmas present and past. He's being led by the Spirit. Spirit, what are you telling me? So he's going into, led by the Spirit, and he can see what's happening in the temple. So chapter 8, Spirit lifted me up in the air and brought me in divine visions to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate, where stood the statue of jealousy, which stirs up jealousy. He said to me, Son of man, look toward the north. I looked toward the north, and I saw northward the gate at the altar of jealousy. Do you see the great abominations that the house of Israel is practicing here, so that I must depart from my sanctuary? But you shall still see greater abominations. And he led me to the entrance of the court, and he shows them all these terrible things that are happening in the temple right now. And that is why Jerusalem has fallen, is because the people have turned away from God. Do you know what you did wrong? Yes, we worship temples. We worship idols in the temple. Yeah, the parable of the vine in chapter 15, where it talks about the good vine and it's dried up and it's good for nothing. It reminds me a little bit of the wineskins that Jesus talks about in the gospel. What is it good for? It's not good for anything. Again, you can kind of sense that Jesus is reading Ezekiel. Chapter 16 is Ezekiel likes playing with the imagery of the harlot, and using, rather sexual images and stuff, but it's not about sexuality. It's about the person turning away from God. That was a very vivid way of speaking, that the idea is, I have brought up this young woman, this bride, I have brought her up as a child, I have taught her, and then I marry this child. It's very strange imagery, so don't get too lost in it. But the idea is not about, I guess there's some question about abusiveness or whatever. No, it's not all about that. It's an imagery of Israel, the people of God, flirting with and then going and being really intimate with the other nations. That's what it's about. It's an imagery for that, which again, we might not use today, but it was very powerful. I think it's still very powerful, really. I mean, because I meet with married couples today and they say, what's the worst thing that could ever happen? They never think that adultery will happen in their relationship, right? That's the worst, right? Just for someone to be with somebody else in that way. So we still have that still resonates with us, that is terrible. That is awful. Well, that's as bad as Israel has been. They have committed adultery against the God who loved them, who gave his entire being to them. And Jerusalem has played the harlot and gone to all these other people. That's the idea. You are my bride, Israel, and my bride has gone off and done all these terrible things with Assyria, with Babylon, with Egypt, with all these things. You are paying the price for those things. Why are we getting a divorce? We are getting a divorce because you went and were with all these other people, right? So you are paying the consequences of the choices that you made, right? So that's the idea. It has really nothing to do with marriage or with sexuality or anything. It has to deal with the Jewish people as the bride of God. Imagery. You have the image of the eagles and the vine, talking about Babylon and Egypt. Chapter 20, that's when the elders come and speak. It's like, okay, I won't even use imagery, but here's all the things you have done wrong, people. So we get this in chapter 20, this whole history of how people were unfaithful to God and to the covenant. He spells it all there for them in chapter 20. You did all these things. He speaks real clearly, not really in imagery, but you have done terrible things. My Sabbaths you have desecrated. You have gone to idols, all these things. Chapter 22. Let me spell it out even more clearly. Here's the crimes that you have committed. Jerusalem, all these things that you have done. And then the chapter 23, that's as scandalous as the adulterous bride. But he tells the story of the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel and compares them to like two sisters who then go and do all kinds of bad things. Again, it has nothing to do with sexuality. It's the image of sexuality and the image of harlotry. But it has to deal with being intimate with other nations when God was meant to be there for them. And again, remember, it's strange because we don't think in terms of like someone marrying two people, but that was pretty common in those times as well. So again, as we read Ezekiel, it can be a little overwhelming and can be like, what is going on and why is God beating down the people so much? Well, think of it as a loving father explaining what has been done and basically saying also, you can do better than this. And this does not have to be the end. But why are you going through all this suffering? Why did that happen? Well, a lot of you did it to yourself, kid. So let's get this worked out. So I think that Ezekiel has a really proper place for us, and if we understand it in those terms, it's very applicable. Again, not immediately as comforting as the book of comfort and consolation of Isaiah, but really helpful for us to think of. Sometimes we need to spell these things out in the training of our youth and of the people. Is why are we suffering? Sometimes these sufferings are things that we have brought upon ourselves. Okay. And then we go into, I put it in the wrong section. But in chapter 25 and following, then we hear about the other condemnations to the surrounding nations. It's a bit like, if we go with that child analogy, if a kid throws a ball at the head of somebody else and the teacher sees it, the kid's going to get in trouble and the kid might get detention or whatever for throwing a ball at the other person. But then you got a couple other kids that are standing around and laughing at him and enjoying them. Well, they should get punished too because they were enjoying the pain that was given to the other person. So you picked on that kid. You are the main problem, but all you standing around as well, you're a problem, and you're a problem as well. And so you will also hurt as well. So Ammon, Moab, Edom, the Philistines, Tyre, Sidon, all of these other surrounding nations, you aren't off the hook either. You were enjoying Judah's demise. Egypt, you said you have created the Nile by yourself. Your gods have done that. Okay, punishment on you too. So I was thinking of that Oprah thing. You get a curse and you get a curse. Everybody gets a curse. Everyone, punishment on all of y'all. I think that's actually she's saying about you get a car and you get a car and you get a car. I think Deacon Nicholas used that for Donut Sunday one time. You get a donut and you get a donut. Everybody gets a donut. So you get a curse, you get a curse, you get punishment all across. So the oracles of the other nations, that was supposed to be the first thing there. But that's the next segment there. It's against the other nations. You all are participants in this demise as well, and you are not off the hook. Then, finally, we get to the really beautiful stuff. That there is the good news. But you have to travel through that, talking about the consequences and the difficulties. Why am I experiencing all this pain? Why am I experiencing all this suffering? Here's the reasons. And now, in spite of all that, I am still, God says, I am still faithful to you, and I'm going to create a new Israel, even better than before. Here's the good news. So, not quite in that section, but I'm also going to mention in chapter 18, which is an important piece as well. Again, speaking to an exiled people, what went wrong? Much of this is talking about particularly to their fathers or their grandfathers, maybe not to them, or if he's speaking to the younger generation. You will only be held responsible for what you do. So I'm not going to judge you on account of what your fathers did, even though you might be suffering the consequences of what they did. You will be judged for and held responsible only for what you do, which is a beautiful movement. And we might say, well, of course, that makes sense. But that, if you look like back in Joshua and the way that judgment was handed out in earlier times, it was you are held accountable for the sins of your fathers. And so it's a movement. It is an adjustment, a growth in understanding, right? The difference between personal responsibility and the sufferings that we are taking because of the decisions that other people said. In sloppy language, we might say that I am being punished because of what my fathers did or my grandfathers did. Why am I going through this? It's because I am being punished on account of my father's sins. That's a little bit sloppy. A little bit better to say is because of the decisions my fathers made, I am now suffering those consequences, but I will only be held responsible for what I choose to do in the midst of that. In modern times, we might say, what is the baggage? What are the things that where are your places where you're being held back? And let's keep that all in mind. What did you come from an abusive household? Did you do what is your origin story? And let's take that into account. And you're not going to be held accountable for those kinds of things as much, right? It's what are you doing with your situation? That's not correct. That it's supposed to be 33, 10, 11. A little typo there. We have this idea of this restoration and conversion. And this is a great kind of summary then of Ezekiel, I think. As for you, son of man, speak to the house of Israel. You people say, our crimes and our sins weigh us down. We are rotting away because of them. How can we survive? Answer them, as I live, oracle of God, I swear, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why should you die, house of Israel? That's That's a great, really summary there of Ezekiel. Our crimes and our sins weigh us down. We have been reading for 32 chapters how terrible we are. This is weighing us down. How can we even move? Look, I don't want you to suffer. I want you to live. But we have to go through that first so that you can live. So I'll beat you down a whole bunch, but then I'll raise you up. That's the idea. Famously in Ezekiel, we have that section about the dry bones, right? Them bones gonna rise again, whatever that song is. And that's that idea of, it looks like the kingdom of Israel is done for, just dry bones. It's this vision, right? And then he gets this vision of these dry bones and then flesh and skin coming back onto them. What seems to be completely dead. The kingdom has been completely wiped out by Babylon. It's going to rise again. So it's a beautiful image, strange, but beautiful image of complete death brought to new life. It's probably the most powerful and memorable image of Ezekiel. Much more famous than these two sticks, but the two sticks are joined together and they're going to have new life in chapter 37:15. And then chapter 43, we have this image of the Lord returning. So the Lord had left the temple. That's that idea that the chariot of God, or whatever that we hear at the very beginning of Ezekiel, it comes all the way from Jerusalem to Chebar. It has left Jerusalem, and the presence of the Lord is gone, and now comes to Ezekiel. And now this image of it returning to Jerusalem, to this new Israel. We hear about that in 43. Some of Ezekiel, talking about how the last part is so beautiful. It maybe doesn't immediately seem so beautiful because there's a lot of measurements. I will measure this. Then he went, like in chapter 40, verse 6, then he went to the gate which faced the east, climbed its steps, and measured the gate's threshold, which was found to be a rod wide. The cells were a rod long and a rod wide. The pilasters between the cells measures 5 cubits. The threshold of the gate adjoining the vestibule. I'm like, that is pretty dry. But it calls back to Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, which we're going to talk about in January. It calls us back to the really boring parts of the Bible there in Exodus, where we get these specific measurements of what the temple, what the Ark of the Covenant, all these things, what this should look like. And that would be then exciting to the people because we're getting new instructions of what this will be. So as boring as it might be for us to read, it was very exciting to hear that because it's calling them back to the Exodus, how they got called out from Egypt into a new promised land. It's that same idea. We're getting called out of Babylon into this new land. Oh, it's so exciting. How beautiful. It's like when you see the blueprints or the floor plans. I imagine that was the case when Good Shepherd was building the new church. You see the blueprints. Oh, this is what it's going to look like. It's so exciting. We're going to get to a new church and it's going to be this and it's going to be this. And we're going to have this. Oh my goodness. We're going to have like an office and we're going to have a school and all these things. It's going to be amazing. Well, most of the times you look at blueprints, I'm like, okay, great. But the promise and the future that is coming, it's very exciting. So it seems a bit dry, but just think in those terms of, these are the blueprints for, it's like happening. This is real. That's what it's meant to evoke. And then the book ends then kind of like Revelation, if you will, of a complete renewal complete restoration of Israel. The very last words there, chapter 48, verse 35. The perimeter of the city is 18,000 cubits. The name of the city shall henceforth be, the Lord is here. Oh, I get kind of chills just even saying that. The Lord is here. Bam, we have arrived. It has a beautiful ending. Then just a few other gems that didn't really fit into the overall sense, but things I don't want to go without mentioning of Ezekiel is the prophet as a watchman. So this is that where we hear about it at the beginning and we hear about it later. Again, there was some sort of editor that said, okay, we need to put that earlier as well. But the idea, and we just heard about this a month or two ago, about the prophet needing to protect the people, and I need to see the signs. If you have this watchman, and if you're being attacked by forces coming to attack you, you need someone to be there to say, hey, people are coming, we're being attacked. That's there to protect. And so the prophet needs to be on the watch and let people know, need to have the eyes of faith to see, hey, what are those danger areas that are coming? Again, a prophet is not necessarily someone who sees the future. It sometimes is, but it's someone who speaks on behalf of God. And a prophet can see the signs, can see these danger pieces that warns the people. We are being attacked. These things are coming at us. So you have a prophet of the nation, of the world, and in modern times might say, if these things continue as they go, our nation is going to fall apart or whatever. And so sometimes people are called prophets in that sense. They are speaking the truth in the midst of the people that don't want to hear it. And that's what Ezekiel did. He told these truths that the people didn't want to hear, but they needed to hear them. The role of the shepherd is also a beautiful one. As someone, as a shepherd myself here at Good Shepherd, I really like this passage, and I also really don't like this passage from chapter 34, 1 through 6. Again, it's kind of like the prophet. Speaking of the watchman, chapter 34, verse 2, that says, the Lord, woe to the shepherds of Israel who have been pasturing themselves. Should not shepherds rather pasture sheep? You have fed off their milk, worn their wool, and slaughtered their fatlings. You did not strengthen the weak, nor heal the sick, nor bind up the injured. You did not bring back the strayed, nor seek the lost, but lorded over them harshly and brutally. What have I done wrong? I'm like that little kid. Oh, no. Sorry. So it's very good and things for me to review over and over again to say, how does this relate to me? And if I say, no, I'm good, I'm probably who he's talking to. So if I do not feel somewhat condemned by these words, I'm not listening close enough. So it's good for me, at least, to read over this passage over and over again. And I hope that all the shepherds of the church, priests, bishops, or otherwise, that have the mission of caring for people, be that in your family or be that in a wider community, have you been caring just for yourself, or have you been caring for those who have been entrusted to your care? And then chapter 36, verse 26 is that beautiful passage about, I will replace your stony hearts with fleshy hearts. I mean, that could fit. I mean, that fits in really with that new Israel, right? But 36, chapter 26, I will sprinkle clean water upon you and cleanse you from your impurities and from all your idols. I will cleanse you. I will give you a new heart and place a new spirit within you, taking from your bodies your stony hearts and giving you natural hearts. Beautiful passage. Sometimes I use that for confirmation or other places. It's a really lovely passage. And that comes from Ezekiel. So those are some great gems from Ezekiel that I didn't want to go without mentioning, and some of the greatest hits of Ezekiel there. Well, that pretty much sums up the prophet Ezekiel. And I hope this has been helpful there. Again, that's out of date. I forgot to copy and paste, so we'll just exit out of that. This is probably the slide I wanted to put. So there's the updated one. Sometimes just see like, oh, there's green. It's set. I did it. Then I didn't. So. All right. So there is that. Okay. So go back to the folks here. Unmute all. Mute all, allow you to unmute yourselves. Unmute all. All right. So hopefully if you have anything to say, I can hear you this time. Last week, I don't think I could. So any questions or comments or things to add or subtract?
I do. I don't know how
Sure.
to say it, but
yeah.
It just reminds me of what we're living through, what we're suffering consequences of some of the decisions that we've made in the past 20 or 30 years when we've decided to take God out of the schools and God out of this. And
Sure.
It just runs very parallel to.
Sure. Now it's hard for me to speak exactly about what those things are, but yes, I think we can, we need those strong shepherds, those strong voices, those strong prophets to speak about those things and be able to name what has happened and what went wrong and how can we get out of this. Absolutely.
Very difficult, yeah.
Yes.
I feel like when we grew up, we were very strict and we knew right from wrong and we didn't have a lot, but we made do. But then as we grew and had our own kids, we overdid. We were like, oh, I didn't have this as a kid, so my kids are going to have what I didn't have. And in general, I think we've raised a very spoiled and entitled generation. But I mean, you're there. I'm sorry. I don't mean you or you, but I think in general, we have a lot of people that feel entitled to everything.
Sure.
Without having to work for it.
Yep.
And I blame some of my generation for doing that. So.
No, I think that's a good thought, a good revelation, a good thing to consider of where have we strayed and what can we do to fix those things. And I think that there is quite a bit of truth in that. And yet we tend to grow better through suffering and through difficulty. And we tend not to grow as well when we have everything.
Right. But I'm encouraged because I normally go to the Holy Trinity Bible study, and there are so many young women there who get kind of emotional, but they're so spiritual. They've inspired me. They're so good. Dawn, you're probably one of them. But I mean, they're just so, I don't know how to explain it, but it is encouraging.
I concur. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that feel that, okay, we've hit the wall, and they've felt God speaking to them as God has spoken through Ezekiel of, yeah, this does not end well. There's
right.
This is the wrong path. It's like so I've got this image of, remember those little mazes that you do? Is it like you have your pencil or whatever, and you go through and like, well, that's a dead end, so I have to go all the way back, and that's kind of the image there that I think we're discovering there. We have planted some dead ends, and they're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I liked the. I was reflecting on chapter 4, verse 4, where he says, "Then you shall lie on your side, while I place the sins of the house of Israel upon you. As many days as you lie there, you shall bear their sins." and then he tells him to lie there for 390 days.
A long time.
And then go to the other side for 390 days. And then like baking bread over human excrement, cutting your hair and burning it. Like he's doing all these things for the communal sins of the people of Israel, right?
Yeah. Again, that's in his kind of street theater phase there.
Yeah.
I mean, street theater maybe downplays it a little bit, but he's doing these things that are very, public in front of people as a prophecy through imagery, through me acting these things out. This is what we are.
They probably would have laughed at him.
Probably, yeah.
Some of these radical. And I
Well,
don't
I mean,
know.
as an artist, I kind of resonate with that as well. Like the modern, some of these, the modern ways of doing theater or whatever that break the bounds of the normal theater structure, but they're very profound, right? So,
Mhm.
Good way to get attention,
it is.
get people's attention about what he's doing.
One of my favorite classes in college was called Environmental Choreography. I think it was the name of it. And again, it's not about the environment, like let's dance about trees. But it was using the environment and choreographing to this. And one of my favorites was we went and I choreographed a piece in the racquetball courts at KU. And so I was in one court, and then my dance partner was in the next court, and I said, okay, you have to find us. And there's a whole bunch of them, right? So there's these 10 different courts or something. And so the dance class, when we performed it, they had to go find us. So, and then you like looked on top. And so the image was meant to evoke like a zoo. So you had to find us. And I started the dance piece. I was all curled up in a little corner because like, where is he? And so trying to evoke that sense of the zoo, right? And then the dance evolved from there. But same kind of thing. I resonate that with as an artist of, oh, he's using the environment. He's using this different way of teaching. You have built your lives on human excrement. I'll show how that works. Anything else? Anything on the Facebook or the YouTube? I'll check the YouTube here. I'll show how that works. Oh, I'm in a loop.
Right.
Dawn, Pat, anything else?
No, thank you.
No,
All right. Well,
good
thanks
summary. Good summary.
Great, thanks.
Mhm.
Well, thanks so much. And yeah, next week we'll jump into Daniel, which is no small matter either. I'm just crazy. I'm crazy.
Daniel could be good.
It could be.
Yeah. Never.
Well, and I can't really study much ahead because I'm afraid I'm gonna get him confused. So I try to just focus in on one.
Yeah, I would too.
And so I haven't even opened Daniel yet. So I have to do a lot of work this week.
Haven't we had some readings on Revelations lately? Seems like either that or I've read something. I was like, I always think of Daniel when I think of Revelations. So
Yeah, well, liturgically, we're at the end of the liturgical year, and we
There we
tend to
go.
do things that we
mhm.
do Daniel and Revelation and stuff that kind of evoke
Mhm.
the end of time. So,
Okay.
all right. Well, we will see you next week then.
All right. Have a
Thanks
good
so much.
weekend.
You
Thank
too.
you, Father.
Don't work too hard.
I will do what I can.